Hey, what's going on, everybody? I just dropped a new recipe. I made some birria, Mexican birria with beef, and some Mexican rice, just topped off with some cilantro. So I've been eating. So reason why I'm filming like this is because my tripod broke. So I did all the cooking and kind of just did some really quick snippets of the food, but I'm going to talk about just kind of the breakdown with everything. So I'm going to try and go step by step here, and hopefully the quick snippets of me cooking the food explains that. So barbacoa, birria, all that is kind of in that same family. There's just some slight cooking differences in terms of the birria itself. So I'm using 3 different peppers. I'm using onions. I'm using fire roasted tomatoes, which I just bought from the can. You can do fire roasted tomatoes to your your own liking. If you want to do them manually over the grill, over you want to flame throw it, whatever, you can do that. I just did the can just to save myself some time. And there's some seasonings and things like that that are going to be used in this dish, but everything's pretty accessible. It's pretty easy. This dish does take a little bit of time in comparison to some of the other recipes that I've dropped, but it's one of those, once you have it in the oven, it's a set it and forget it kind of deal for like 3 hours. And the prep time and the actual cooking time before it goes in the oven is not terribly long. So let me kind of go step by step process. So when it comes to the beef, you want to get like kind of a decent sized chuck roast. A chuck roast really goes well in stews. For those that I've eaten like beef stew or anything like that, chuck roast breaks down really well over time. You don't necessarily have to buy like Wagyu or prime. If you can find a good deal on it, go ahead. But I just did USDA choice because it's going to be cooking for a long time. So it's not like I'm buying like a really good quality ribeye or a really good quality New York strip and I want to eat it as is. I mean, this is going to be braised and liquid for a very, very long time. So it's going to break down and it's going to shred apart like pulled pork anyway. So, but like I said, if you can find a good deal on prime chuck roast, sometimes you can find a deal where maybe it's only like a couple bucks more for prime versus USDA choice. If that's what you want to do, go for it. Good quality meat can't always be beat. There's very few circumstances where it really does matter. In this case, it doesn't matter, but if you want to buy it, go for it. Get anywhere from like 2.5 to 3 pounds. This was about 2.5 pounds just because it's just my wife and I, and my baby is not quite eating this type of food. So I didn't want to get like a 3.5 pounder. So I just went with that. And in regards to the meat, I used a Dutch oven. So you'll see, or in terms of this dish, I used a Dutch oven. A Dutch oven is fantastic. I've been using a Dutch oven for years for any kind of braised meat and braised meals, and it's absolutely fantastic. It's one of my favorite things in my kitchen. I don't use it as often, but it's super heavy duty. I highly recommend it for your kitchen. It's anywhere from 50 to 60 bucks depending on the brand, but it's worth it. It'll last. It's like a good cast iron pan. It's gonna last you forever. As long as you take care of it, it'll never go bad. When you heat up your Dutch oven, heat it up as if you were gonna heat up a pan in regards to searing a steak, because that's what you're going to do first. You're going to get your chuck roast. A lot of times chuck roast are pretty big, so I would cut it in half or even cut it into thirds. And what you're going to do is you're going to season your meat pretty liberally. Salt, pepper, garlic is what I did, because there's going to be other spices in the mix. I don't think you necessarily need to. You just want to give the meat a little bit of flavor. But the most important step is to sear your meat. You're not cooking it, you're just searing it. So whether you cut up strips of the meat like this and sear it off in batches, or if you cut it up smaller and sear it off in batches, as long as you're searing the meat, because there's nothing worse than just boiled meat. Don't go through all this trouble and go through all this work if you're not going to take time to sear the meat. So in this case, you'll see in the video, I cut up the steak into thirds. I basically cut them up as if they were like little New York strips. And I seared it. I seasoned them pretty heavy. I seared it. And then once you're done searing it, you're going to put it off to the side. What I would do even prior to that is you're going to work with your chilies. So I had guajillos, anchos, and chile de arbor. And I'll put the description or the recipe in the description below. But you're going to remove the seeds. I kept the seeds in the tree chilies and the chile de arbor just because I want a little bit of heat. But if you don't want this to be overly spicy, remove all the seeds first, and then you're going to toast up your chilies. You don't have to toast them up for a long time, just until your kitchen gets like really aromatic. That's when I would take it off. And then you're going to boil the chilies after you toast them. And the reason why is just because when you're toasting it and then when you're boiling it, you're adding some flavor. You're kind of waking it up a little bit when you toast it off. And then when you boil it, you're rehydrating them. And rehydrating them will allow you to blend them better. So when you pour your water into your saucepan to rehydrate your peppers, just make sure that the peppers are submerged. You don't necessarily have to add a ton of water. You just got to bring them up to boil, and once they boil for like a minute or two, turn off the heat and set the pan aside and let them hydrate in that pan for like 10 to 15 minutes. So if you're able to start the peppers before while they're heating up and becoming hydrated, then work on your meat. So those are the steps that I would do. I apologize for putting one in front of the other, but that's what I would do, just so you're able to knock out both things at one time, and it'll allow you to just kind of smoothly transition into cooking this dish. Once you brown off your meat, take it out of the pan, set it to the side, and then you're going to add your onions and your aromatics and your seasoning and your garlic and all that stuff. And you're going to toast off the onions for a little bit. Make sure your pan is not super hot. Hot enough to get a good saute, but not hot enough where everything is going to burn. So, so you're going to brown off your onions for a little bit. Once you do that, add a little bit of that water that you used for the hydration of the chilies. I added probably like a quarter cup. Some people don't do that. I think that water is gold in itself. And I'm a big advocate for using everything as much as you can, but don't pour all that water in there. I would say maybe quarter cup to a half a cup. If you're gonna do 3-ish pounds, maybe like half a cup, close to 3/4 of a cup of that liquid, but you don't have to add a lot. You're just adding a little bit more flavor, and then the rest of that water you can throw away. Add your peppers, add a can of fire roasted tomatoes, or like I said, if you're gonna roast your own tomatoes, probably 2 large tomatoes that are fire roasted or broiled, or however you're going to blacken them would be sufficient. But I used 1 can of fire roasted tomatoes. You're going to throw everything in there with your onions. So onions, your aromatics and seasonings, and your peppers and your liquid. You're going to add all that in there. And then also you're going to need a few cups of beef broth. I just used bouillon cubes and I made my own broth. So I believe it was 2 cups of beef broth. You're also going to throw that in there. So whether you're going to make your own broth or if you're just going to buy it already pre-packaged or pre-boxed in those little broth containers that they come in, you're going to add that. Once all your liquid is in there, you can do one of 2 things. You can take all that stuff out and put it in a blender, or you can use an emulsifier and just blend everything manually inside of the Dutch oven. That's what I did, but I just did that because I didn't want to have more of a mess to clean by using a blender. Then I would have had to taken it out, blended it, poured it back in. I didn't want to do that. So if you have an emulsifier, that's a great tool. Just be careful because it gets a little bit messy, and you can adjust your speed depending on the emulsifier that you have. But once you get a consistency that's just like a soup, like a tomato soup kind of consistency, throw your meat back in there. And then make sure your meat is submerged in the liquid, and then bring that up to a boil. So then you're going to turn your heat back up, bring it up to a boil. As soon as it starts boiling, throw it into the oven, and then you're done for now. And that's going to take about 3 hours, maybe 2 hours and 45 minutes, just depending on, it really depends on the amount of meat that you have. So in this case, this was about 2.5 pounds of meat. That took about 2 hours and 40 minutes to cook, give or take. And if you want to check on it, like let's just say you do have 3.5 pounds of meat that's braising in there, I would just let it sit there in the Dutch oven with the lid on. I would say maybe check in on it at the 2.5 mark. Get a fork, be careful, obviously wear oven mitts and take it out of the oven and be safe about it. But take it out of the oven really quick and just get a fork, or even get 2 forks. So if you imagine my second fork, and see if you're able to pull it apart. And if it's not easy, if it's not tearing apart and cutting like butter, throw it back in there. Don't spend a lot of time checking it. Don't lose your heat. And don't let the liquid stop braising, because the whole point is that it's cooking in its own liquid, and it should come out nice and tender like pulled pork. So that's one way to check it, but don't check it for until 2.5 hours. And if you see that it's not pulling apart, it's probably going to be the full 3 hours. But it really depends on just the quality of meat, the type of meat that you're using, because birria technically could be lamb. Lamb or goat actually is traditionally how it's cooked, but beef is fine. It's a lot more accessible. Chuck roast is a lot more affordable, and frankly, it's all about the sauce. If your sauce isn't good, the type of meat that you do is really not going to make a difference. But and goat is just way too expensive, and it's really, really hard to find anyway. So it's all about the sauce, but just check in on it. Just don't check in on it every hour. Like you're not smoking a pork butt where you have to check it every hour. You really have to just set it and forget it. So, and then once it's done, it should be pull apart tender, and then you're good to go. And when it comes to the Mexican rice, my rice is a little bit different than some people's. Mexican rice is very controversial, I think. I think that a lot of people just have their own spin on it. It's kind of like barbecue. Like people feel like their barbecue is the best, and another person might say the same thing. But Mexican rice is very simple. It doesn't really have a lot of components to it. So my rice, I put onions in it. You don't have to, but I do. And I use corn. My grandma, she didn't use onions, but she used corn. I like the corn. It reminds me of home, reminds me of my grandma, gives it a nice little crunch on certain bites. If you don't want corn in there, you don't have to. That's optional as well. But the most important thing is when you're making this Mexican rice is that you want to rinse the rice. Rice has a lot of starch in it. So if you put it in a bowl and you rinse it off, whether you're doing 2 cups, 3 cups, it doesn't matter. I did 2 cups. I think if you do 2 cups minimum, that's good. But if you do more, it's just going to be more starch. So as you rinse your water, you'll notice, or rinse your rice, you'll notice that the water it's going to be like a milky water type of consistency. So you have to keep rinsing it. Drain it, rinse it, drain it, rinse it. And once your water starts to look clear, like bath water, then that means your rice is good to go. Once your rice is clean and once it's rinsed off, get a pot. Then you're going to start sauteing your rice a little bit. If you have onions, you're going to saute the rice and onions. If you have rice and corn, you're going to saute the rice, the corn, and the onions. Once you get it to a good consistency, you're going to add your tomato sauce. People might shame me for not blending up my own tomatoes or like actual fresh tomatoes, because that's traditionally how it's made. But I just used a can of tomato sauce. It's typically like 14.5 ounces, 15 ounces. Just throw all that in there, cook off the sauce a little bit. Once you do that, then you're going to add your broth, your chicken broth. I did a cup of chicken broth, and then I did a cup of water. But that's just because I didn't want this overly salty. Because sometimes chicken broth can be pretty salty. So I just kind of balance it out that way. And the tomato sauce has a good amount of sodium in it. So I wanted to utilize those ingredients only. And then I wanted to salt it myself at the end in case it needed it, which in this case it did. It needed probably like a good half a tablespoon of salt to finish it off. But yeah, and once you add your broth and your liquid, you're going to bring it up to a boil. Once it gets to a boil, you're going to simmer it on low for like 20 something minutes or until the rice is done. So very much like the birria, check in on the rice maybe at like the 15-minute mark and see how it's doing, but just don't take the lid on and off because you want to be able to make sure that the rice is cooked. And then that's pretty much it. It's a very simple dish, just birria and rice and corn. You can top it off with cilantro. You can add Mexican cheese to it. You can, do cotija cheese. You can do queso fresco. You can add some avocado to this. You can add cilantro to this. I added a little bit of pickled onions because I had some left over. You can eat it with tortillas. You can not eat it with tortillas. I mean, it's a pretty versatile dish in how you want to make it. You can add beans to this. I mean, but this is pretty simple. It's just meat and rice with a little bit of vegetables. And yeah, hopefully you enjoy the recipe. I'm going to take a little bite here. Like, how can that be bad? It's smoky, has a little bit of kick to it. Cilantro gives it some freshness. The rice, I love Mexican rice because it's so subtle, but it just has a lot of flavor to it. I could have done a better job rinsing my rice, but the rice still came out pretty solid. But your star is the meat. So your sauce should really have like a nice, almost like a burnt look to it. And your beef should just be pull apart. Like when I pulled this out of the oven, I was just able to just tear it apart like I'm tearing a piece of paper. So enjoy the recipe. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please hit me up in the comments below. And the rest of this video will just be me cooking. Cheers.
Carla's birthday today? So long, Hurley, and then people start.
You're okay.